Isolated rancher feeds wounded Indian elder. The next morning his house is surrounded. Silas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as he observed the man fallen near the goat pen. The midday sun punished the high desert mercilessly, and that motionless figure on the ground worried him deeply. It wasn't common to find someone passed out on his property, especially an elderly man with such striking indigenous features. The rancher approached slowly, immediately noticing the wounds on the stranger's arm and leg. Dried blood stained his simple clothes, and his breathing was faint but steady. Silas Miller knew he couldn't leave that man there, not with the intense heat on that September day. Without hesitation, he carried the stranger in his arms, surprised by the light weight of that frail body. The walk to the wooden house wasn't long, but each step felt eternal under the pitiless sun. Silas couldn't get the serene expression on the man's wrinkled face out of his mind. As if even unconscious, he conveyed a peace that the rancher himself hadn't felt in a long time. Inside the simple house, Silas improvised a bed on the living room sofa. He fetched fresh water from the well and began carefully cleaning the stranger's wounds. As he worked, he observed details he hadn't noticed before: old scars scattered across his arms, a discreet necklace made with seeds that seemed to have special value, and calloused hands that told a story of much labor. The man woke when Silas was applying a damp cloth to his forehead. His eyes opened slowly, revealing a deep and wary gaze. He tried to get up quickly, but weakness prevented him. Silas made calming gestures with his hands, trying to show he meant no danger. "Easy, my friend. You were hurt out there. I brought you inside to recover," said Silas in a soft tone, even knowing he might not be understood. The man watched him for a few moments, assessing the situation. He murmured some words in a language the rancher didn't recognize, but his tone didn't seem aggressive. Silas offered a glass of water, and after hesitating a moment, the stranger accepted, drinking eagerly. For the rest of the afternoon, Silas cared for the wounded man as best he could. He prepared a simple chicken and vegetable soup, offered clean clothes, and redressed the wounds. The man accepted the care with a mix of gratitude and caution, always watching every movement of the rancher. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. As the day progressed, Silas noticed more intriguing details about his unexpected guest. The necklace he wore wasn't just decorative. It seemed to be made of rare seeds and small bones worked in an artistic way. The scars on his arms formed patterns that suggested they weren't the result of accidents, but of ancient rituals or conflicts. When night fell, Silas offered his own bed to the wounded man, but the man refused with firm gestures. He preferred to stay on the living room sofa, always alert, as if waiting for something. The rancher didn't insist, respecting the stranger's choice. Alone in his room, Silas couldn't sleep. For 3 years, he had lived isolated on that property after losing his wife Sarah, a victim of a prolonged illness. Loneliness had become his constant companion, and the presence of that stranger stirred in him feelings he had tried to bury: the need to care for someone, to be useful, to not be completely alone in the world. Through the bedroom window, he watched the starry sky, typical of the high desert, without the pollution of big cities. It was a quiet night, with only the sound of crickets and the wind rustling the dry leaves of the saguaro. Silas Miller finally fell asleep thinking about the strange coincidence that had brought that man to his door. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, dozens of riders were moving silently through the dry scrubland. Men and women with faces painted with natural dyes rode toward his property, guided by almost imperceptible tracks left by the man who now dozed on his sofa. At dawn, Silas Miller woke with a strange feeling, as if something in the air had changed overnight. The silence seemed thicker than normal. He got up slowly and walked to the living room to check on his guest, but found the sofa empty. The man had disappeared during the night. Worried, Silas Miller left the house looking for signs of the injured man. Perhaps he had felt better and decided to leave, although that seemed unlikely given his condition the previous night. It was then that something extraordinary caught his attention. The horizon was not empty as it should have been. Hundreds of dark silhouettes dotted the arid landscape in every direction. Silas Miller rubbed his eyes, thinking he was still dreaming, but the figures remained there. They were riders, mounted men and women, forming a perfect circle around his property. The rancher's heart began to beat faster when he realized he was completely surrounded. At the center of that human circle, near the porch of his house, stood the injured man he had cared for during the night. He no longer looked fragile or debilitated. He was standing erect with a posture that radiated natural authority. His wounds seemed to have improved drastically, and his expression was serious and determined. Silas Miller felt his legs trembling as he grasped the magnitude of the situation. This was not a simple injured traveler he had helped out of compassion. The number of people who had gathered to retrieve him, the organized way they had surrounded his property, everything indicated the man had far greater importance than he had imagined. "My God, what have I gotten myself into?" he murmured to himself, watching the scene unfolding before his eyes. The elderly man walked slowly toward the house, accompanied by two younger riders. His movements were calculated, and his gaze fixed on the rancher conveyed a mixture of gratitude and determination. Silas Miller didn't know whether to go out to talk or stay inside the house, but his curiosity and concern overcame his fear. When he opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the visual impact was even more impressive. Men and women of different ages, all with striking indigenous features, watched him in absolute silence. Their faces were serious, but not necessarily hostile. It was as if they were waiting for an explanation or an important decision. The man he had cared for approached the porch and began to speak in his native language. His words sounded like a formal speech, punctuated by gestures directed both at Silas Miller and the riders around him. The rancher realized he was being introduced or described in some way, but he couldn't understand the content of the speech. One of the young men accompanying the elder stepped forward and, to Silas Miller's surprise, addressed him in clear, well-articulated English. "My name is Chayton. This man you cared for during the night is my grandfather, Grey Wolf, the elder of our community." The revelation hit Silas Miller like a bolt of lightning. He had cared for an elder, an indigenous leader of an entire community. That explained the presence of so many people and the organized way they had positioned themselves around his property. He tried to process the information while observing the serene face of Elder Grey Wolf. I didn't know," stammered Silas Miller, feeling small before the magnitude of the situation. "I just wanted to help. He was injured and—" Chayton raised his hand in a gesture that seemed reassuring. "We know. My grandfather told us how you treated him. We are not here to cause trouble." But the tension in the air suggested the situation was more complex than Chayton's words let on. Silas Miller noticed that many of the riders carried bows and spears, not as a direct threat, but as a demonstration that they were a community prepared to defend themselves. Elder Grey Wolf moved closer to the porch and extended his hand to Silas Miller. When their hands met, the rancher felt the firmness and roughness of decades of work. The handshake was long and meaningful, and in the elder's eyes, Silas Miller saw something he didn't expect: mutual respect. Chayton translated his grandfather's words. "He wants you to know that your kindness will not be forgotten, but there are serious matters we need to discuss." "What kind of matters?" asked Silas Miller, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Before Chayton could answer, the sound of approaching engines drew everyone's attention. A cloud of dust rose on the dirt road leading to the property, indicating the arrival of several vehicles. Silas Miller immediately recognized the cars. They were his neighboring ranchers, probably alerted by the unusual activity in the area. The situation, already tense, was about to become drastically more complicated. Silas Miller saw a subtle change in the faces of the indigenous riders, a defensive readiness he hadn't noticed before. On the other side, he knew his neighbors were likely armed and prepared for what they would consider a property invasion. "Chayton, you need to speak with your grandfather quickly," said Silas Miller urgently. "The men arriving are my neighbors. They will misinterpret this situation." The young man quickly translated for the elder, who only nodded gravely. It was as if he already expected this complication. Grey Wolf said a few words in a low tone to Chayton, who then addressed the other riders through gestures and words in their language. The first 3 cars stopped at a safe distance from the circle formed by the Indigenous riders. Silas Miller recognized his neighbors, Mr. Whitaker, owner of the ranch to the north, Mr. Lawson and his 2 sons from the property to the south, and Mr. Sterling, an older rancher who lived miles away but was always involved in territorial matters of the region. Mr. Whitaker was the first to get out of the car carrying a hunting rifle. His movements were cautious, but his expression showed determination. "Silas Miller," he shouted from a distance. "Are you all right? What is this situation here?" The rancher raised his hands in a peacemaking gesture. "Everything's fine, Mr. Whitaker. There's no problem here." But appearances suggested otherwise. Dozens of armed riders surrounding a property was not a scene that inspired tranquility. Mr. Lawson and his sons also got out of their vehicle, and Silas Miller noticed they were armed too. Mr. Sterling, the oldest of the neighbors, approached a bit closer, keeping his hands visible, but near the weapon he carried on his belt. "Silas Miller, you have 5 minutes to explain what is happening before we call for reinforcements." The implicit threat in Mr. Sterling's words made Silas Miller feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was literally in the middle of 2 groups that could come into conflict at any moment. He looked at Elder Grey Wolf, who remained calm but alert, and then at Chayton, who awaited instructions. "Chayton, tell your grandfather these men are my neighbors. They are worried about me and the safety of the area. They didn't come to attack, but they might misinterpret the situation if we don't talk," Silas Miller explained quickly. The young man translated for the elder, who, after a moment of reflection, made a hand gesture. Immediately, all the riders lowered their weapons, though they remained in position. It was a gesture of goodwill that Silas hoped his neighbors would understand. Mr. Whitaker noticed the change and relaxed his body slightly, but kept the shotgun ready. "Silas, we want an explanation. The whole community is worried." Silas took a deep breath before answering. "Yesterday I found this injured man near my property. I cared for him overnight. This morning his family came to get him." "Family?" questioned Mr. Lawson, observing the number of people around. "This looks more like an army." Chayton stepped forward, speaking in clear Portuguese so everyone could understand. "We are from the Diné Indigenous community, from the ancestral lands of this region. Mr. Silas Miller cared for our elder when he was injured. We came only to ensure his safety and to thank him for the kindness shown." The mention of ancestral lands caused an immediate change in the rancher's expressions. Silas felt the tension rise instantly. Land issues were always delicate in the region, especially when they involved historical claims. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, his voice laden with distrust. "Ancestral lands? What ancestral lands? All the properties here have had legal documents for decades." Elder Grey Wolf said something to Chayton, who translated carefully. "My grandfather did not come here to question anyone's ownership today. He was investigating information he received about illegal dealings involving lands in the region." "What kind of illegal dealings?" asked Silas, feeling a growing worry form in his chest. Chayton hesitated for a moment before answering. "Someone has been selling lands that do not legally belong to the sellers. My grandfather received information that several properties in the region may have fraudulent documentation." The silence that followed was tense and heavy with implications. Silas felt his world begin to shake. His property had been bought 5 years ago, right after Sarah left, when he wanted to isolate himself from the world. What if the documents he had were fake? Mr. Whitaker was the first to break the silence. "That is a very serious accusation. Do you have proof of what you're saying?" Elder Grey Wolf walked slowly to a small leather bag that one of the riders carried. He took from it some papers, folded and yellowed with age. Even from a distance, it was possible to see they were old documents. Chayton explained, "These are records kept by our community for generations, maps, demarcations, old agreements. My grandfather has been studying them for weeks, comparing them with information that reached us." Silas felt his legs go weak. "Chayton, what kind of information reached you?" The young man looked at his grandfather, who nodded, allowing him to continue. "A lawyer from the capital approached us last month. He said he was investigating a scheme involving forged land documents. Several rural properties were sold by someone who had no legal right to them." The revelation hit Silas like a punch to the stomach. He remembered clearly the man who had sold him the property, Vance Sterling, a well-dressed fellow who claimed to have inherited several lands in the region and wanted to get rid of them quickly to invest in city businesses. Mr. Lawson moved closer, his expression changing from distrust to concern. "Silas, who did you buy your land from?" "Vance Sterling," answered Silas in a weak voice. He said he had inherited it from a distant uncle. Elder Grey Wolf and Chayton exchanged meaningful looks. The elder said something in his language that made several riders nod gravely. "My grandfather knows that name," translated Chayton. "Vance Sterling has sold land to at least 6 different people in the last 2 years. The problem is that land did not belong to him." Mr. Sterling lowered his weapon completely, understanding the gravity of the situation. "If this is true, we could all be involved. My property was also bought from a middleman 3 years ago." Mr. Whitaker and Mr. Lawson exchanged glances, clearly worried. The tension between the two groups was beginning to turn into a shared concern. If there was really a document fraud scheme in the region, everyone could be a victim. Silas Miller sat down heavily in the porch chair, trying to process the information. His whole life had changed when he decided to buy that property. It was his refuge, his fresh start after losing Sarah. The possibility that it was all based on fraud was devastating. "Chayton, what exactly was your grandfather doing when he got hurt?" asked Silas Miller. The young man hesitated again before answering. He had arranged a secret meeting with someone who claimed to have important information about Vance Sterling. When he arrived at the agreed location, 3 men attacked him and tried to steal the documents he was carrying. The story was becoming more complex and dangerous than Silas Miller had imagined. This wasn't just about property issues, but a scheme involving violence and intimidation. Mr. Whitaker stepped closer to the porch. "Where did this attack happen?" "On the old road that leads to the town of Gallup near the dry reservoir," replied Chayton. Mr. Lawson knew the place well. "That spot is isolated, perfect for anyone wanting to do something unseen. Silas, which direction from your property did you find the elder?" Silas Miller pointed east. "Over there, near the goat pen. He must have walked for miles injured to get here." Elder Grey Wolf said something to Chayton, who translated with a serious expression. "My grandfather wants to thank you again for helping him. He says few men would have the courage to care for a wounded stranger without asking questions." Silas Miller was moved by the elder's gratitude, but his concern about the overall situation kept growing. "Chayton, these men who attacked your grandfather, do you know who they were?" "They weren't from around here. They spoke with a different accent, probably from some big city. But the most important thing is they knew exactly what my grandfather was carrying." The implication was clear. Someone had informed the attackers about the meeting and the documents the elder possessed. There was an organized network behind this fraud scheme. Mr. Sterling moved closer to the group. "Gentlemen, I think we're all in the same situation here. If there really is a forgery scheme, we need to work together to sort this out." It was at that moment that another vehicle approached the property. It was an official truck from the Gallup Municipal Hall, kicking up even more dust on the dry road. Silas Miller recognized the vehicle. It was used by the only municipal government employee responsible for rural issues in the region. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. From the vehicle stepped a middle-aged man wearing a sweaty dress shirt and carrying a worn leather briefcase. It was David Henderson, the employee responsible for rural documentation at the municipal hall. His expression was serious and concerned as he observed the unusual situation before him. "Good morning, everyone," said David, walking cautiously toward the group. "I received an anonymous call reporting a possible land invasion on this property. I came to check on the situation." Silas Miller stood up to explain. "David, there's no trespassing here. We're discussing property documentation issues in the region." The official opened his briefcase and took out some documents. "Interesting that you mentioned that. This week we received a formal complaint about irregularities in several rural deeds in this area. The coincidence seemed to surprise everyone." Chayton quickly translated for his grandfather, who nodded gravely as if he had already expected this information. David continued, The complaint was filed by an attorney from Albuquerque who was investigating a document forgery scheme. According to him, a man named Vance Sterling may have illegally sold several properties. The name confirmed the suspicions of everyone present. Silas Miller felt a chill in his stomach as he realized his worst hypothesis was being confirmed. "David, what kind of irregularities were found?" asked Mr. Whitaker. "Mainly forged signatures of previous owners who had already passed away, and the use of documents from people who never existed. The scheme is sophisticated and involves complicity from corrupt notary offices." Elder Grey Wolf approached David and handed him the old documents he carried. The official examined them with growing attention, comparing them with papers from his own briefcase. "These documents are legitimate," said David after a few minutes. "They are authentic historical records of the region." "Where did you get these?" Chayton explained. "Our community has always kept records of the ancestral lands. My grandfather has been the guardian of these documents for over 30 years. David studied the hand-drawn maps on the old documents, comparing them with modern official maps. "This is extraordinary. These records show boundaries that match exactly with several current properties." Silas Miller stepped closer, anxious. "David, does this mean our properties are illegal?" "Not necessarily," replied the official. "It means we need to investigate each case individually. Some of you may be victims of fraud, others may have legitimate documentation." Mr. Lawson stepped forward. "How can we know who is in a legal situation and who was deceived?" David opened more documents from his briefcase. "I brought with me the deeds filed at the municipal hall for all properties in this region. We can start by comparing them with the elders' historical records." During the next hour, a fascinating process unfolded on the porch of Silas Miller's house. David, assisted by Chayton in translating and interpreting the old documents, began to map the true legal situation of each property. Mr. Whitaker's property was the first to be analyzed. To his relief, his documentation was correct. He had legitimately purchased it from a family that had held legal rights to the land for 3 generations. Mr. Lawson was not so lucky. His property had been sold by Vance Sterling using forged documents from a supposed heir who never existed. The discovery left him visibly shaken. Mr. Sterling was in a partial situation. Part of his property was legitimate, part had been acquired through fraudulent documentation. He would have the right to keep the legal portion and seek compensation for the fraudulent part. When it came to Silas Miller's turn, the silence grew heavy. David carefully examined the purchase documents, compared them with historical records and verified signatures. After long minutes, he looked up with a grave expression. "Silas, I'm sorry to inform you, but your property was sold using completely forged documentation. Vance Sterling forged the signature of a supposed previous owner and used corrupt notary offices to register the sale." Silas Miller's world collapsed at that moment. 5 years of his life, all his savings, his refuge after losing his wife, all built on an elaborate lie. He sat down heavily, feeling lost and betrayed. Elder Grey Wolf approached Silas Miller and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. His words, translated by Chayton, brought an unexpected perspective. "My grandfather says you are not guilty of anything. You are a victim, just as our community has been a victim for decades." David Henderson continued his explanation. "According to Elder Grey Wolf's historical records, this specific property is part of the ancestral lands of the Diné community. They have legal rights to this area." Silas looked at the elder, expecting to see triumph or satisfaction in his eyes, but found only compassion. The elder said something to Chayton, who hesitated before translating. "My grandfather wants you to know he did not come here to drive you out. He recognizes that you are a victim and that you have cared for this land with respect all these years." The elder's unexpected kindness moved Silas deeply. Amid the chaos of discovering he had lost everything, he found understanding and compassion where he least expected it. Mr. Whitaker, who had remained silent, stepped forward. "Silas, we all know how well you've cared for this land. You didn't deserve to go through this." Mr. Lawson, who was in the same difficult situation, added, "We need to find a way to resolve this that is fair to everyone." It was then that David brought crucial information. Gentlemen, there is a state law that allows land revalidation agreements in cases like these. If the indigenous community agrees, it is possible to establish an agreement that benefits both the rightful owners and those who were deceived. Chaitan translated for his grandfather, who listened attentively and then asked a question in his language. "My grandfather wants to know what kind of agreement would be possible," translated Chaitan. David explained, "There are several options: shared land use, territorial division, coexistence agreements, or the indigenous community could even choose to offer part of the land as compensation to those who were deceived, provided there are benefits for both sides." The proposal opened possibilities no one had considered before. Instead of a conflict where someone would lose everything, there could be a solution where everyone gained something. Silas looked at Elder Greywolf. "Chaitan, tell your grandfather I would very much like to talk with him about these possibilities. I don't want to take anything that doesn't belong to me, but I also invested 5 years of my life caring for this land." The elder smiled for the first time since he had arrived at Silas's house. His response, translated by Chaitan, revealed a wisdom and generosity that surprised everyone. "My grandfather says the land does not belong to any man. Men belong to the land. He proposes we talk about a way for everyone to care for it together." David was optimistic about the willingness to dialogue. "With this attitude from both sides, I am sure we can find a legal and fair solution. I will prepare the necessary documents to formalize the negotiations." But before negotiations could advance, another vehicle approached the property. It was a large, luxurious car, completely out of place in the rural setting. Silas did not recognize the vehicle, but noticed several indigenous riders instinctively positioning themselves more defensively. 2 men in suits stepped out of the car, clearly out of place in the rural environment. One carried a briefcase of documents, the other was constantly talking on his cell phone. Their movements were tense, and their expressions hostile. The man with the briefcase addressed David directly. "Are you the municipal hall employee responsible for rural issues?" "I'm David Henderson. How can I help you?" "We are attorneys, representing the legitimate interests of the rural properties in this region. We have been informed that there are attempts at invasion and illegal questioning of established documentation." The arrival of the attorneys completely changed the atmosphere of the meeting. Silas Miller immediately realized they were not there to help resolve the situation, but to complicate it. The second attorney finished his phone call and joined the conversation. "We have a court order to prevent any attempt to alter the status quo of the properties in this region." Chaitan quickly translated for his grandfather, who responded with a serious expression. The elder was clearly not surprised by the attorney's arrival. "My grandfather wants to know who hired you," said Chaitan directly to the attorneys. "That is confidential information," replied the first attorney, "but I can assure you we represent legitimate landowners concerned with unfounded attempts at contestation." David Henderson examined the documents the attorneys presented. These orders are very specific and seem to have been prepared with detailed knowledge of the situation here. Silas Miller felt a chill run down his spine. How could attorneys from outside the region have such detailed information about a situation that had only developed that day? Mr. Whitaker voiced everyone's suspicion. "How did you know exactly where to come and what kind of documents to bring?" The second attorney answered evasively, "Our client keeps us informed on matters that may affect their interests in the region." It was then that Elder Greywolf approached the attorneys and said something in a firm tone in his native language. His expression had completely changed. There was no longer the peaceful serenity from before, but an almost threatening determination. Chaitan hesitated before translating. "My grandfather recognizes one of these men. He was among those who attacked him yesterday." The accusation created an instant tension. The accused attorney vehemently denied it, but his body language suggested growing nervousness. "This is an absurd and defamatory accusation," said the first attorney. "We demand it be retracted immediately." But Elder Greywolf did not back down. He pointed directly at the second attorney and said something more in his language. "My grandfather says this man was in the car that fled after the attack. He recognizes the voice and the gestures," translated Chaitan with growing indignation. David Henderson looked seriously at the attorneys. "This is a very serious accusation. If there is a possibility of involvement in assault, I need to notify the proper authorities. The first attorney tried to take control of the situation. We are not going to stand here listening to baseless accusations. We have legal documentation protecting the rights of the true landowners of this region. But Silas Miller was beginning to connect the dots. David, don't you find it strange that attorneys show up here exactly on the day we discovered Vance Sterling's scheme? Mr. Lawson added his suspicion. And how did they know to bring specific documents to prevent exactly what we were discussing? The second attorney, visibly nervous, headed for the car. We don't have time to listen to conspiracy theories. We have made our legal position clear. But before they could leave, David Henderson raised his voice. Gentlemen, as a public official, I have an obligation to investigate any allegation of assault. You need to stay to provide clarification. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. The Diné riders positioned themselves to discreetly block the attorney's exit, while the ranchers moved closer to support David. It was at this critical moment that Silas Miller had an idea. David, didn't you say there was an attorney from Albuquerque investigating Vance Sterling's scheme? How about we call him right now? The suggestion made the two lawyers exchange nervous glances. The first tried to dissuade. That's not necessary. Our documentation is clear, and if your documentation is legitimate, there's no problem verifying it, interrupted Mr. Whitaker. David Henderson picked up his cell phone. I'll call Dr. Simon Reed, the lawyer who filed the complaint. He can clarify if he knows these gentlemen. While David made the call, Silas Miller observed the behavior of the two lawyers. They were clearly uncomfortable and were whispering agitatedly to each other. After a few minutes, David ended the phone call with a grave expression. Dr. Simon confirmed he is investigating a scheme involving corrupt lawyers working with Vance Sterling. He wants to speak personally with these gentlemen. The revelation was like a bombshell. The lawyers weren't just representatives of legitimate owners. They were part of the fraudulent scheme that had harmed Silas Miller, Mr. Lawson, and so many others. The first lawyer attempted a final maneuver. This is a setup. We don't recognize the authority of any outside investigator. But Elder Grey Wolf was not willing to let them leave. He said something firm to his riders, who positioned themselves clearly blocking any attempt to escape. Chayton translated with satisfaction. My grandfather says these men will stay here until the proper authorities arrive. Silas Miller felt a mixture of anger and relief. Finally, the true people responsible for his situation were being exposed. He wasn't just a victim of an isolated fraud, but of an organized scheme that had harmed many innocent people. David called again, this time to the regional sheriff's office. I'm going to request that a sheriff come here. With the elder's accusations and Dr. Simon's suspicions, we have grounds for a formal investigation. While they waited for the authorities to arrive, an interesting transformation happened in the group. The tension between ranchers and indigenous people had completely disappeared, replaced by a feeling of joint struggle against a common enemy. Mr. Whitaker approached Elder Grey Wolf and, without speaking his language, offered water from his canteen. The gesture was accepted with a smile that transcended cultural barriers. Mr. Lawson commented to Silas Miller, It's funny how things change. This morning I was worried about a possible invasion. Now I realize we've all been invaded by con artists. The observation made Silas Miller reflect on the prejudices and fears he had carried. Elder Grey Wolf had proven more honest and compassionate than many people he considered civilized. During the wait, Chayton took the opportunity to explain more about the investigation his grandfather had conducted. For months, our community had been receiving information about suspicious sales of ancestral lands. My grandfather decided to investigate personally when he learned Vance Sterling was planning to sell this entire region to an agribusiness company. The information revealed an even larger dimension to the scheme. It wasn't just about isolated fraudulent sales, but a plan to concentrate rural lands in a few hands through illegal methods. What agribusiness company? Asked Mr. Sterling. We don't know for sure, replied Chayton. That's why my grandfather arranged the meeting that resulted in the attack. The person who made contact promised to reveal details about the final buyers. Silas Miller remembered something important. Chayton, when I bought my property, Vance Sterling mentioned he was getting rid of the lands to invest in bigger business in the city. At the time I thought it was just talk. David added his perspective. If there's a big company behind this, it explains how they managed to bribe notaries and hire lawyers. It's not a cheap scheme to execute. The first lawyer, who had remained silent, made one last attempt to extricate himself from the situation. All these accusations are speculative. We have no obligation to stay here listening to conspiracy theories. But Elder Grey Wolf approached him and said something in a low, firm tone in his native language. Although no one else understood the words, the elder's tone and expression made it clear it was not a suggestion, but a determination. The lawyer seemed to understand the message, regardless of the language barrier, and retreated near the car without attempting to leave. It was then that Silas Miller noticed something he had overlooked before. Among the Indigenous riders there were several women of different ages. One of them, a grey-haired woman, caught his attention by her dignified posture and the way others respected her. Chayton noticed his interest. "That is my grandmother, Morning Star, wife of Elder Grey Wolf. She is the midwife and healer of our community." Silas Miller respectfully approached the woman and nodded in greeting. She responded with a warm smile and said a few words in her language. "She wants to thank you for the care you showed my grandfather," translated Chayton. "She says she recognizes a good heart when she sees one." The woman's simple and sincere gratitude deeply touched Silas Miller. Amid all the legal confusion and disturbing discoveries, that moment of pure humanity reminded him of what truly mattered. Morning Star moved closer and discreetly examined Silas Miller's face. She said something more to Chayton, who seemed to hesitate before translating. "What did she say?" asked Silas Miller with curiosity. "She said you have the sad eyes of someone who has lost someone very important. She asked if you would like her to prepare a calming tea." The woman's intuitive perception of his emotional pain surprised Silas Miller. It was true he still carried the sadness of losing Sarah, and the discovery about the fraud with his property had reopened emotional wounds he thought had begun to heal. "Tell her I would greatly appreciate the tea," replied Silas Miller with an emotional voice. Morning Star smiled and spoke to one of the riders, who immediately dismounted and began retrieving utensils from a leather bag. Silas Miller was fascinated watching how quickly she improvised a small fire and began preparing a mixture of herbs she carried with her. While the tea was being prepared, the regional sheriff finally arrived. He was an experienced middle-aged man who observed the unusual scene with professional interest. "Good morning. I'm Sheriff Dalton. I received a call about a possible assault and document fraud." David Henderson stepped forward to explain the situation. "Sheriff, we have a complex situation here. We've discovered a possible scheme involving forged land documents, and the Indigenous elder was attacked yesterday while investigating the case." The sheriff listened attentively as David Henderson summarized all the day's events. His eyes moved between the ranchers, the Indigenous riders, and the two nervous lawyers. "I see. I'll need statements from everyone involved," said the sheriff, starting with the gentleman who was attacked. Chayton volunteered to translate for his grandfather, and Elder Grey Wolf told his version of events with precise details. He described the meeting location, the appearance of the assailants, and how he managed to escape despite his injuries. When it was the lawyers' turn to give their statements, their nervousness became more evident. The first tried to maintain his composure, but the second was clearly unprepared for a formal interrogation. The sheriff, experienced in noticing signs of guilt, focused his questions on the lawyer the elder had recognized. "Where were you yesterday between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. "In office meetings in Albuquerque," the man replied with little conviction. "Is there any way to prove that?" The hesitation in the response was noticeable. "My colleague here can confirm." The sheriff carefully noted the answers and then addressed the first attorney. "And you, sir, can you confirm you were together in Albuquerque yesterday afternoon?" The question created a delicate situation. If he confirmed, he would be creating a false alibi. If he denied it, he would be leaving his colleague in a compromising position. "Well, not exactly together the whole time," he replied evasively. The sheriff smiled discreetly. He had caught an inconsistency in their story. He continued his questioning with more pressure. Gentlemen, I'm going to need you to come to the station for a formal statement. There is enough evidence to consider you persons of interest in the investigation." It was at that moment that the second attorney panicked. "I didn't do anything. I only came here because Attorney Blackwood said it was just a matter of documentation." The information slipped out before he could control himself. The first attorney, Attorney Blackwood, looked at his colleague with anger and despair. "Who is Attorney Blackwood?" asked the sheriff immediately. The second attorney, realizing he had said too much, tried to correct himself. I meant to say..." But Sheriff Dalton was too experienced to let the opportunity pass. "No, you were quite clear. Attorney Blackwood sent you here. Who is he and what is his relationship with Vance Sterling?" Attorney Blackwood tried to take control of the situation. "We are not obligated to answer any more questions without our own attorneys present." "Of course you have the right to attorneys," replied the sheriff calmly. "At the station. You are under arrest for questioning." The arrest of the attorneys created a sense of relief and vindication in the group. Silas Miller felt that justice was finally beginning to be served. As the sheriff carried out the arrest procedures, Morning Star approached Silas Miller with a clay cup containing the tea she had prepared. The liquid had a golden color and gave off a soft, comforting aroma. Silas Miller drank the tea slowly, feeling a sense of calm spreading through his body. He didn't know what herbs Morning Star had used, but the effect was remarkably soothing. "Tell your grandmother this is the best tea I've ever had," said Silas Miller to Chayton. When the message was translated, Morning Star smiled broadly and said something that made Chayton laugh. "What did she say now?" "She said the recipe includes hope as a secret ingredient, and that you will need plenty of hope for the coming days." The simple wisdom of the woman touched Silas Miller deeply. He really did need hope. He had lost his property, discovered he was the victim of an elaborate fraud, but he had also found good people willing to help him. With the attorneys being taken away by the sheriff and the legal situation moving toward a proper resolution, the group could finally focus on the main issue: how to resolve the property situation fairly for everyone. David Henderson addressed Elder Grey Wolf. "Elder, with your permission, I would like to propose a formal meeting next week. I will invite Dr. Simon Reed from Albuquerque, a representative from the Land Stewardship Office, and you can bring whoever you deem necessary." Chayton translated the proposal, and after a brief consultation with Morning Star and other community members present, the elder nodded positively. "My grandfather agrees to the meeting," said Chayton, "but he has one condition. He wants Mr. Silas Miller to be present as a representative of the ranchers who were deceived." The proposal surprised Silas Miller. "Why me?" Chayton smiled. "My grandfather says you have shown you have a good heart and an open mind. He trusts you will represent everyone's interests well." The elder's trust moved him deeply. On a day that had begun with the discovery that he had lost everything, he was being invited to actively participate in the search for a fair solution. Mr. Whitaker agreed with the choice. "Silas Miller, you are perfect for this. You understand the situation of those who were deceived, but you've also shown respect for the Indigenous community." Mr. Lawson and Mr. Sterling also supported the nomination. Within a few hours, Silas Miller had gone from an isolated victim to a representative of a group seeking justice. As the day drew to a close, the Indigenous riders began preparing to return to their community. But before leaving, Elder Grey Wolf made a point of saying goodbye to Silas Miller personally. Through Chayton, he said, "My grandfather wants you to know that you will always be welcome in our community. He says a man who cares for a wounded stranger without asking for anything in return is a true brother." Silas Miller was moved by the words and replied, "Tell the elder that caring for him was not a favor. It was a privilege, and that I would very much like to visit his community." Morning Star approached one last time and handed Silas Miller a small pouch with the tea herbs. "For when the sadness circles back," translated Chayton, "she says healing comes not only from the plants, but also from new friends." When the riders finally departed, creating a cloud of golden dust in the high desert sunset, Silas Miller felt transformed. The day had begun with the shock of discovering his property was the result of fraud, but it was ending with the feeling of having found a new family. Mr. Whitaker was the last neighbor to leave. Silas Miller, I don't know how all this will be resolved, but I am sure you will not be left helpless. What you did today, opening your home for talks and showing respect for the elders' rights, that will not be forgotten. Alone again on his property, which perhaps would not be his for much longer, Silas Miller sat on the porch to process everything that had happened. Morningstar's tea was still taking effect, keeping his mind calm despite the uncertainty about the future. Looking at the horizon where the riders had disappeared, Silas Miller realized his life had changed completely in a single day. He didn't know where he would live in a few weeks, if he would be entitled to any compensation, or how the legal situation would be resolved. But he knew he was no longer alone. He had found good people, both among the neighboring ranches and in the indigenous community, willing to fight for justice. And that, he reflected as the sun set over the high desert, was worth more than any property. That night, Silas Miller slept better than he had in months. His dreams were filled not with nightmares of fraud and loss, but with images of proud riders, a wise woman preparing tea, and an elderly elder whose eyes conveyed a wisdom built over decades of struggle and resistance. He did not yet know it, but the events of that day were only the beginning of a journey that would transform not only his life, but the entire region. The fight against Vance Sterling's scheme would reveal much deeper and more dangerous connections, involving not only rural properties, but an entire network of corruption that extended to the highest levels of local power. The next day, Silas Miller awoke with a determination he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Sarah's departure, he had a clear purpose: to work for justice, not just for himself, but for all who had been harmed by the fraudulent scheme. The meeting with attorney Simon Reed was scheduled for next Tuesday at the Gallup Municipal Hall. Silas Miller would use the time until then to properly prepare for his new role as representative of the affected ranchers. His first task would be to speak with other possible victims in the region. If Vance Sterling had managed to defraud 3 properties just in the immediate area, there were probably many more cases yet to be discovered. Silas Miller began by making a mental list of all the properties he knew in the region, trying to remember which ones had changed owners in recent years. It was meticulous work, but necessary to gauge the real scope of the scheme. During his research, Silas Miller discovered something disturbing. Talking to more distant neighbors, he learned that at least 6 other properties had been sold by intermediaries in the last 3 years. All followed the same pattern: sellers who claimed to represent distant heirs or families who wanted to quickly get rid of the land. A particularly shocking case was that of Mrs. Martha, a 72-year-old widow who had bought a small property to raise chickens and plant vegetables to supplement her retirement. She had invested her life savings in an elaborate fraud. Silas Miller felt obliged to visit Mrs. Martha to explain the situation. It was a difficult and painful conversation. The elderly woman first didn't believe it, then became outraged, and finally cried when she understood she had lost everything. "My son, what am I going to do now?" she asked through tears. "That land was my livelihood for my old age." Silas Miller promised Mrs. Martha that she would not be left helpless. "You will be part of all the negotiations. We will fight together to find a solution that protects those who were deceived." By the day of the meeting at the municipal hall, Silas Miller had identified 9 confirmed cases of fraud in the region, representing dozens of affected families. It was a much bigger problem than anyone had initially imagined. The meeting room at the municipal hall was full. Besides Silas Miller representing the affected ranchers, those present were Elder Grey Wolf and Chayton, attorney Simon Reed, the investigator from Albuquerque, a representative from the Land Stewardship Office, David Henderson from the Municipal Hall, and Sheriff Dalton with news about the investigations. Attorney Simon Reed opened the meeting with alarming information. "Gentlemen, the investigation has revealed that Vance Sterling's scheme is much broader than we imagined. He was not working alone, but as part of an organization operating in at least 4 states in the Northeast." The revelation caused worried murmurs in the room. Silas Miller asked, "Counselor, how many people may have been harmed?" Based on documents seized from the arrested attorneys, We estimate that more than 200 families have been victims of the scheme in New Mexico alone. The number was staggering. Silas Miller thought of Mrs. Martha and imagined 200 other families in the same desperate situation. Sheriff Dalton continued with the investigation's findings. Attorney Blackwood, one of the arrested lawyers, has decided to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He revealed the identity of the true head of the organization. Everyone leaned forward, anxious for the revelation. The scheme is run by a businessman named Colonel Harrison, who owns agribusiness companies in several states. The strategy was to forge documents, to concentrate rural lands, and then resell them to multinationals interested in expanding operations in the Northeast. Silas Miller felt anger growing in his chest. This wasn't just about individual scams, but a systematic plan to steal land from humble families to benefit large corporations. The Land Stewardship Office representative, Dr. Maria Helena, brought a legal perspective. Based on the information revealed, the federal government can intervene to protect the affected families. There is a land regularization program that can be applied in cases like this. Elder Gray Wolf, through Chayton, made a surprising proposal. My grandfather suggests that the ancestral lands of the Diné community be used as the basis for a pilot project of coexistence between indigenous communities and farming families harmed by the scheme. Dr. Simon Reed explained the implications. The elder is proposing something innovative to create a model of shared land use where both the indigenous community and the deceived families can live and work together. Silas Miller was moved by the generosity of the proposal. Chayton, tell your grandfather that this is one of the noblest things I've ever seen. He is offering a solution that benefits everyone. Dr. Maria Helena was enthusiastic. A proposal like this could become a national model for resolving land conflicts. The Land Stewardship Office would be very interested in supporting a pilot project. The negotiations continued for several hours, but the atmosphere was optimistic. Instead of the confrontation many feared, an innovative solution was emerging that could benefit all involved. By the end of the day, the basic terms of the agreement had been defined. The Diné community would receive official recognition of their ancestral lands, but would offer part of the area to farming families harmed by the scheme under a shared use arrangement. The deceived families would receive rights to plots for family farming and housing, with technical assistance provided by both the indigenous community and government programs. A cultural exchange center would be established to promote sharing between indigenous traditions and sustainable modern agricultural practices. Silas Miller would be the general coordinator of the project, representing the interests of the farmers, while Chayton would represent the indigenous community. All resources obtained through the recovery of assets from Vance Sterling and Colonel Harrison would be invested in the project's infrastructure. When the meeting ended, Silas Miller felt euphoric. In 1 week, he had gone from a desperate victim to the coordinator of a project that could transform the lives of hundreds of families. Elder Gray Wolf approached him to say goodbye, and through Chayton said, "My grandfather wants you to know that it all started when you chose to help a wounded stranger. He says that kindness always generates more kindness." Silas Miller replied emotionally, "Tell the elder that taking care of him was easy. The hard part will be living up to the trust he has placed in me." In the following months, Silas Miller dedicated himself entirely to developing the project. His house, which he discovered he had the right to keep as part of the agreement, became the operations center where harmed families came for information and where government representatives met to plan the implementation. Mrs. Martha was one of the first to enroll in the project. At 72 years old, she was excited about the prospect of learning traditional farming techniques from the indigenous community. "I never thought I'd have the chance to start over at my age," she said to Silas Miller. The project also attracted national attention. Journalists from across the country came to learn about the innovative coexistence model. Silas Miller found himself giving interviews to newspapers and television programs, something he never imagined he would do. During one of these interviews, the reporter asked, "Mr. Silas Miller, how would you describe the transformation in your life?" Silas Miller thought about the question before answering. "A year ago, I was a lonely man, embittered by the loss of my wife, living isolated on a property I discovered was the product of fraud. Today I coordinate a project that is changing the lives of over 100 families. The difference was choosing to help instead of closing my heart. 6 months after the first meeting with Elder Grey Wolf, the project was officially inaugurated. The opening ceremony was a celebration that blended indigenous traditions with typical high desert festivities. Silas Miller walked through the project area, observing the transformations. Families building their new homes, children playing together regardless of ethnic background, adults exchanging knowledge about planting and land stewardship. Morning Star, the elder's wife, had become a maternal figure for many of the families. Her medicinal herbs and teas were helping people far beyond physical issues. She was tending to the emotional wounds left by the fraud and the abandonment. Chaitan had become a natural leader, serving as a bridge between the two communities. His ability to communicate and mediate minor conflicts was proving fundamental to the project's success. Silas Miller himself had profoundly changed. The loneliness and bitterness he carried after losing Sarah had been replaced by a sense of purpose and an extended family that included dozens of people from diverse backgrounds. During the inauguration ceremony, Elder Grey Wolf gave a speech that was translated by Chaitan. My grandfather said that when he found a man willing to care for a wounded stranger, he knew there was hope for a peaceful coexistence between our peoples. Today we see the result of that hope. Silas Miller replied with emotion. Elder Grey Wolf, when I cared for you that night, I only wanted to do what was right. I never imagined I was planting the seed for all of this. Thank you for teaching me that helping others is the fastest way to heal our own wounds. The story of Silas Miller and Elder Grey Wolf spread far beyond New Mexico. The model of coexistence they created began to be studied and replicated in other regions of the country, where there were land conflicts. Universities sent researchers to study how two such different communities managed not only to coexist, but to thrive together. The answer was always the same: mutual respect, a willingness to listen, and the understanding that everyone was a victim of the same system that concentrated land in the hands of a few. Vance Sterling and Colonel Harrison were sentenced to long prison terms. Their confiscated assets were used to expand the project and create similar centers in other regions. Justice had been served, but more important than the punishment was the building of something positive from the tragedy. 2 years after that first meeting, Silas Miller was marrying again. His bride was Eleanor, a teacher who had come to document the project for her master's thesis and ended up falling in love with both the work and him. The ceremony was held in the project's community center, with elements from both Catholic tradition and indigenous rituals. Elder Grey Wolf and Morning Star were in the front row as the special godparents they had become. During his speech at the wedding, Silas Miller looked at all those present, ranchers, native people, government workers, journalists, family, and said, 2 years ago I was a man who had lost hope. Today I marry surrounded by a family I chose, and that chose me. I learned that when we open our hearts to help others, we don't just change their lives, we transform our own existence. Elder Grey Wolf stood up and, in Portuguese he had learned especially for the occasion, spoke his first words in Silas Miller's language. My brother Silas Miller, you taught me that kindness has no color, no origin, no borders. Today, we are one family. Emotion overwhelmed everyone present. It was the perfect symbol of how two different cultures could unite through understanding and mutual respect. In the following years, the project continued to grow. Silas Miller and Eleanor had 2 children who grew up speaking both Portuguese and the Diné language, playing just as much with indigenous children as with descendants of European settlers. The children of the project became living symbols that harmonious coexistence was possible. They saw no differences where their parents had seen barriers. For them, diversity was richness, not a source of conflict. The project also became economically sustainable. The combination of traditional indigenous techniques with modern agricultural methods resulted in unique organic products that were sold across the country. The income generated benefited all the families involved. Silas Miller often walked through the property he once thought he had lost forever, observing the transformations. What had begun as his individual land had become the home of a prosperous and united community. Morning Star, now over 80 years old, continued to be the unofficial matriarch of the entire community. Her medicinal teas and her wisdom were sought by people of all ages and backgrounds. She had become a living bridge between ancestral traditions and modern needs. Chaitan had completed higher education and become a lawyer specializing in Indigenous rights. He used his knowledge to help other communities in similar situations, always carrying the model developed in the project as an example of a peaceful solution. Elder Grey Wolf himself, now over 85 years old, remained active and respected. His decision to transform a potentially conflictual situation into an opportunity for collaboration had become legendary in the region. During a visit from university students interested in studying the project, Silas Miller was asked what the secret to the initiative's success was. He replied, "There is no secret. What we did was simply choose to see the other as a human being equal to us, with the same fears, the same hopes, the same needs. When Elder Grey Wolf appeared injured on my property, I could have ignored him or treated him with suspicion. I chose to care for him as I would care for anyone. That choice changed everything." One of the students asked, "But wasn't it difficult to overcome the cultural prejudices?" Silas Miller smiled. "Of course it was. But I discovered that prejudice is like ignorance. It disappears when you get to know the person for real." After talking with Elder Grey Wolf, seeing how he cared for his family, learning from his wisdom, it became impossible to see him as different or threatening. Another student asked about the practical challenges. "How do you resolve conflicts when differences of opinion arise?" "By talking," replied Silas Miller simply, "always talking. We established from the beginning that everyone has the right to be heard, that every tradition deserves respect, and that the common good must always outweigh individual interests. When there are disagreements, we all sit down together until we find a solution that works for everyone." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing, the project had become so successful that the federal government decided to create a national program based on the model developed by Silas Miller and Elder Grey Wolf. Similar coexistence centers began to appear across the country, always adapted to local characteristics, but following the same basic principles of respect, dialogue, and collaboration. Silas Miller was invited to participate in international conferences on land conflict resolution. His simple story of a rancher who cared for an injured tribal elder had become a worldwide example of how seemingly impossible situations can be transformed through goodwill. During one of these conferences in Brasilia, Silas Miller met delegates from African countries facing similar land dispute issues. They wanted to understand how the Brazilian model could be adapted to their realities. "The foundation is always the same," explained Silas Miller to the delegates: respect for human dignity, willingness to listen to the other side, and the courage to abandon historical prejudices. Cultures may be different, but fundamental human values are universal. Returning from Brasilia, Silas Miller found a surprise waiting for him at the project. Elder Grey Wolf had organized a special party to celebrate the 5th anniversary of their first meeting. The party gathered hundreds of people, families from the project, authorities, journalists, and visitors from various parts of the country who came to learn about the model of coexistence. But for Silas Miller, the most important guests were the friends he had met along the journey. Mrs. Martha, now 77 years old, was radiant. She had become an expert in an indigenous vegetable cultivation technique that tripled her production. "Silas Miller," she said with a wide smile, "this land I thought I had lost turned into the best thing that ever happened to me in my life." During the party, Elder Grey Wolf made sure to tell the story of how it all began once again, this time for everyone present. "5 years ago I was injured and lost. A man who didn't know me took me to his home, cared for me, fed me, asked for nothing in return. That simple kindness changed the destiny of hundreds of families." Silas Miller replied emotionally, "Elder Grey Wolf, you taught all of us that when we extend a hand to help someone, We are actually planting seeds of transformation that can grow far beyond what we imagine. Morning Star approached with a special gift for Silas Miller, a handmade necklace made with the same seeds the elder used when he was found injured. "So you never forget where it all began," she said through Chayton. Silas Miller put on the necklace and felt connected not only to the indigenous tradition, but to the entire journey he had traveled, from a lonely and bitter man to a community leader and symbol of hope. As the party continued into the night, with traditional indigenous music blending with desert bluegrass, Silas Miller climbed a small rise to observe the scene. Dozens of families celebrating together, children playing without noticing cultural differences, adults sharing knowledge and experiences. Eleanor joined him, carrying her youngest son in her arms. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how unpredictable life is," replied Silas Miller. 5 years ago I was a broken man who had lost everything I thought was important. Today I have a huge family, a clear purpose, and the feeling that I'm contributing to something bigger than myself. "And what made the difference?" asked Eleanor, though she already knew the answer. "The difference was choosing to care for someone who needed help, without thinking of the consequences. It was choosing to see Elder Grey Wolf as a human being, not as a stranger or a threat. It was choosing to trust when it would have been easier to distrust." His eldest son, 4 years old, ran up to them speaking excitedly in a mix of English and Diné about the games he was inventing with the other children. It was a scene that perfectly symbolized the future they were building. "Daddy," said the boy in English, "Grandpa Grey Wolf taught me a new song." Silas Miller smiled upon hearing his son refer to the elder as Grandpa. It was natural for the children in the project to treat all adults as family, regardless of origin. "What song is that?" asked Silas Miller. The boy began to sing a traditional Diné melody that spoke of the importance of caring for the land and the people. Though he didn't understand all the words, Silas Miller grasped the message. Everything is connected, and caring for others is caring for oneself. That night, when the celebration had ended and everyone had returned to their homes, Silas Miller stayed alone for a while on the porch of his house, the same porch where he had found the wounded elder 5 years earlier. Gazing at the starry sky of the high desert, he reflected on all he had learned. The greatest lesson wasn't about shared agriculture, indigenous rights, or conflict resolution. The greatest lesson was about the human capacity to transform tragedy into hope, isolation into community, distrust into love. Silas Miller took the small pouch of herbs Morning Star had given him years before and prepared a cup of the calming tea. As he drank, he thought of Sarah, his first wife. He felt she would be proud of the journey he had traveled. The pain of losing her had transformed into motivation to care for other people. The next day, news arrived that would bring a new challenge to the project. A multinational corporation was interested in investing in the region, offering jobs and economic development, but its plans included changes that could affect the delicate balance they had built. Silas Miller gathered the project council, composed of himself, Elder Grey Wolf, Chayton, representatives of the settled families, and government technicians, to discuss the proposal. The company offered to build a food processing plant that would generate 200 direct jobs, plus infrastructure that would benefit the entire region. In return, they would need a specific area within the project's lands for the industry's installation. "It's an interesting opportunity," said Silas Miller, "but we need to carefully analyze if it's compatible with our principles." Elder Grey Wolf, through Chayton, expressed his concerns. "My grandfather remembers that promises of economic development don't always benefit local communities. He wants guarantees that our way of life will be respected." One of the representatives of the settled families, Mr. Lawson, the same neighbor who had participated in the first meeting years before, brought the practical perspective. "The jobs would be very welcome, especially for our young people, but we cannot compromise everything we've built." Silas Miller proposed a careful approach. "What if we invite the company's representatives for a meeting here? They need to know our project, understand our values, and demonstrate how their proposal aligns with our goals." The meeting with the multinational was scheduled for the following week. Silas Miller used the time to prepare a complete presentation about the project, highlighting not just the economic aspects, but primarily the human and environmental values that guided the entire initiative. On the day of the meeting, 3 company executives arrived, clearly impressed with the organization and visible prosperity of the project. Silas Miller received them accompanied by Elder Grey Wolf, Chayton, and representatives from all the involved families. "Gentlemen," began Silas Miller, "before we discuss any business proposal, we want you to understand what this project represents. Here, we don't just have an economic initiative, but a community based on values of respect, sustainability, and inclusion." The company's lead executive, Mr. Sterling, responded, "We understand that, Mr. Silas Miller. In fact, that is exactly why our company became interested in the region. We want to be part of a development that is socially responsible." Elder Grey Wolf, through Chayton, asked direct questions about the factory's environmental impact, the types of products that would be processed, and what percentage of the jobs would be designated for the local community. Mr. Sterling seemed prepared for the questions. "Our factory will process exclusively organic products using clean technology. 70% of the jobs will be for local residents, and we offer a technical training program." The answers seemed promising, but Silas Miller knew details were fundamental. "Mr. Sterling, our community makes decisions collectively. Any agreement needs to be approved by all involved, and our values are not negotiable." "What specific values?" asked one of the other executives. Silas Miller looked at Elder Grey Wolf, who nodded for him to explain. "Respect for community autonomy, environmental sustainability, cultural preservation, and the guarantee that economic development strengthens local people instead of making them dependent on external decisions." Mr. Sterling showed interest. "Our company is migrating to a corporate social responsibility model. A project like this could be a world example of how industry and traditional communities can work together." The negotiations extended over several weeks. Silas Miller insisted that any agreement include clauses guaranteeing the company would respect the community's rhythms and traditions, invest in local education and training, and contribute to a cultural preservation fund. Elder Grey Wolf had a specific demand. The company should hire members of the Indigenous community not only as employees, but as cultural consultants to ensure operations respected ancestral traditions. After intense negotiations, they reached an innovative agreement. The company would establish its factory in the region, but would operate as a cooperative where the project community would have a 40% share in the profits. Furthermore, the company committed to following certified sustainable practices and to investing annually in educational and cultural projects. "This agreement is historic," said Mr. Sterling during the signing. "We have never seen a community so well organized and with such clear objectives. You have taught us a new way of doing business." Silas Miller responded, "Mr. Sterling, you have also taught us that it is possible to find partners who respect our values. We hope this will be the model for future partnerships." The factory's installation brought positive transformations to the project. The jobs created allowed more families to settle in the region, always following selection criteria that prioritized victims of land schemes similar to Vance Sterling's. Chayton was hired as the company's Director of Community Relations, a position created specifically to ensure the community's interests were always considered in corporate decisions. Mrs. Martha, now 80 years old, became supervisor of the women's training program at the factory, teaching traditional food processing techniques that proved valuable for industrial production. The project had proven that economic development and cultural preservation could not only coexist but strengthen each other. Universities from various countries sent researchers to study the model, which was being replicated on other continents. During a visit from delegates from the African continent, interested in adapting the model for their countries, Silas Miller was asked what the main lesson of the entire journey was. He thought carefully before answering. "The main lesson is that all social transformation begins with an individual choice to see the other as an equal. When I chose to care for Elder Grey Wolf, I wasn't thinking about starting a social project or solving historical conflicts. I was just doing what I felt was right." One of the African delegates asked, But how do you convince other people to make those choices? How do you replicate that attitude? You don't convince anyone, replied Silas Miller. You show through example. When people see the results of communities built on respect and collaboration, they naturally want to be part of it. Elder Grey Wolf, now nearly 90 but still sharp and active, added through Chaitan, "My grandfather says kindness is contagious. One person who chooses to do good inspires others to do the same. That's how the world changes, one good choice at a time." The elder's simple wisdom deeply touched the international visitors. One delegate commented, "In our countries, we spend millions trying to resolve conflicts through complex political agreements. You've achieved something much deeper through simple gestures of humanity." That day, Silas Miller fully understood the magnitude of what they had built. It wasn't just a successful local project, but a living example that the most effective solutions to human problems are often the simplest. Treat others as you wish to be treated. Years passed, and the project continued to evolve. Silas Miller and Eleanor had 2 more children, all growing up bilingual and bicultural. The children from the project became young adults who brought a unique perspective on diversity and cooperation to universities and jobs. Chaitan married a young teacher who came to work on the project and decided to stay. They had children who represented a truly multicultural new generation, connected to both ancestral traditions and modern technologies. Elder Grey Wolf remained the respected patriarch of the community, his health surprisingly good for someone his age. Morning Star continued preparing her teas and caring for the physical and emotional health of the entire expanded community. The project had become economically self-sustaining and an international model of community development. Silas Miller was often invited to speak at conferences, but he always made a point of returning home quickly. During one such conference, a journalist asked, "Mr. Silas Miller, aren't you tempted to expand this model personally, perhaps moving to a big city where you could have more political influence?" Silas Miller smiled. "My influence is here, with these people on this land. I've learned that real change happens when we put down deep roots in a community, not when we chase external recognition." "But don't you think you could help more people on a larger scale?" "I am helping on a larger scale," replied Silas Miller. "Every person who visits our project takes our experience back to their own community. Every young person who grows up here spreads our values wherever they go. I don't need to leave my home to change the world." The answer reflected a wisdom Silas Miller had developed over the years. Lasting impact comes from depth, not breadth. It was better to completely transform one community than to attempt superficial changes in many places. On an especially hot September afternoon, exactly 10 years after the first meeting with Elder Grey Wolf, Silas Miller was resting on the same porch where it had all begun when he saw a scene that moved him deeply. His eldest son, now 14, was helping a young visitor who had gotten hurt during a walk around the ranch. The boy carried the injured visitor in his arms to the house, exactly as Silas Miller had done with the elder years before. "Dad," the boy said, "this guy tripped and hurt his ankle. Can I take care of him here?" Silas Miller smiled, seeing the repetition of the story that had changed all their lives. "Of course, son. You know what to do." As he watched his son administer first aid to the injured visitor, Silas realized the cycle was completing itself. The next generation had naturally internalized the values of compassion and caring for others. Morning Star approached with her kit of medicinal herbs to help treat the wounded young man. At 85, she remained the community's guardian angel, always ready to care for those in need. "What happened here?" asked Elder Grey Wolf, who had arrived for his daily afternoon walk. Silas explained the situation, and the elder smiled broadly. Through Chaitan, who had arrived with his father, he said, "My grandfather says this is the best proof that our work was successful. The children do naturally what we had to learn." The injured visitor was a university student, researching the project for his undergraduate thesis. As he received care, he said, "You don't even know me, and you're treating me like family. This is exactly what I came here to study." Silas sat down beside the young man. "What's your name?" "Caleb Thompson. I'm a senior in sociology at the University of New Mexico. I want to understand how you managed to create such a tight-knit community." "Caleb," said Silas, We didn't create anything special. We just chose to treat every person who crosses our path the way we'd like to be treated. It's that simple. But it must have been difficult to overcome such big cultural differences, insisted Caleb. Elder Grey Wolf answered through Chaitan, "My grandfather says cultural differences are only a problem when we focus on them instead of focusing on what we have in common. We all want to care for our families, live in peace and leave a better world for our children." Caleb spent 3 days recovering at Silas's house, and during that time he was able to observe up close how the community's dynamics worked. He was impressed by the natural way people from different backgrounds worked together, resolved conflicts, and cared for one another. "Mr. Miller," Caleb said on the day of his departure, "this experience has changed my perspective on many things. May I return to do my field research here?" "You will always be welcome," replied Silas. "But remember, our project is not a laboratory to be studied from the outside. It's a family. If you come prepared to be part of it." Caleb smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." After Caleb left, Silas reflected on the encounter. It was gratifying to see university students interested in studying and replicating the model, but also worrying to think the project could be seen merely as an object of academic study. Talking with Elder Grey Wolf about this concern, the elder offered a reassuring perspective. "People who come here with a sincere heart understand we are not an experiment, but a family. Those people spread our message the right way. The others soon realize they don't fit in and leave." The elder's wisdom proved correct. In the following years, many researchers and visitors passed through the project. Some came with academic or political agendas and quickly realized they couldn't use the community for their own purposes. Others arrived with genuine curiosity and ended up becoming lasting friends. Caleb returned 6 months later, not just to research, but to ask permission to move permanently to the project. He had finished his degree with a thesis on the experience, but concluded he wanted to live the values he had studied. "Mr. Miller," said Caleb, "after meeting you all, I can't be content with just studying social transformation. I want to be part of it." Silas Miller smiled. "Caleb, here you will no longer be a visitor or a researcher. You will be a member of the family, with all the responsibilities that entails." "That's exactly what I want," Caleb replied with conviction. Caleb settled into the project and became responsible for documenting and systematizing the practices developed by the community. His work was fundamental in creating manuals that helped other communities implement similar models. Caleb's arrival also brought an important generational perspective. As a young college student, he served as a bridge between the community and student movements interested in sustainable development and social justice. During a visit from university students organized by Caleb, Silas Miller was asked about the greatest challenges the community faced. "Our greatest challenge," he replied thoughtfully, "is not economic or technical. It is maintaining our original values as we grow. It is easy to be a family when we are few. It is harder to preserve intimacy and mutual trust when we are hundreds of people." One of the students asked, "How do you maintain cohesion then?" Elder Grey Wolf, who was part of the conversation, answered through Chaitan, "My grandfather says we maintain cohesion by constantly remembering our common history. Every new person who arrives needs to know how it all began and commit to our founding values." "And how does that happen in practice?" insisted the student. Silas Miller explained, "Every new family that joins the project goes through an integration period where they learn our history, participate in community activities, and demonstrate commitment to our principles before becoming a full member." Caleb added, "It's like a family indeed. You are not born knowing how to be a family member. You learn by observing, participating, being cared for, and caring for others." The integration system had developed naturally over the years. New families spent 6 months on probation, during which they received full support from the community, but also demonstrated their willingness to contribute and respect the established traditions. This process ensured that only people genuinely aligned with the community's values settled permanently, maintaining the harmony that characterized the project. During the years that followed, the project faced and overcame various challenges. There were periods of severe drought that tested agricultural sustainability. generational conflicts when young people questioned traditions, and external pressures from groups that disagreed with the model of coexistence between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Each challenge was faced in the same way: open community meetings, a search for consensus, and solutions that respected both traditions and modern needs. The experience in solving problems collectively further strengthened community bonds. Silas Miller, now 65, began to think about succession. Although still active and healthy, he wanted to ensure the project would continue to thrive, even when he was no longer leading directly. In a community meeting, he announced his intention to gradually transfer responsibilities to the next generation. For 15 years, we have had the privilege of building this project together. Now it is time to prepare our children to continue what we started. The proposal generated intense discussions. Many community members could not imagine the project without Silas Miller in leadership. Others recognized that the transition was necessary for long-term sustainability. Elder Grey Wolf, now 95, offered his perspective. In the tradition of our community, leadership is not something one possesses, but something one exercises when necessary. Silas Miller will always be a leader, even when others are making day-to-day decisions. The solution they found was to create a rotating council with members from different generations and backgrounds. Chayton, Caleb, the eldest son of Silas Miller, and representatives from various families, would take turns coordinating, always with Silas Miller and Elder Grey Wolf as special advisors. The model worked well. Shared leadership brought diverse perspectives and ensured no single person concentrated too much power. Silas Miller discovered he could contribute more by mentoring new leaders than by trying to control every decision. One December afternoon, 15 years after the first fateful meeting, Silas Miller was organizing documents in his office when he found a forgotten photo. Him and Elder Grey Wolf in the hospital, a few days after the initial incident. In the photo, they both looked tense and uncertain. Neither could have imagined that accidental meeting would result in a community of over 500 people living harmoniously in a model replicated in dozens of countries. Eleanor entered the office and saw the photo. "You both look so different in this picture." "We were different people," replied Silas Miller. "I was a bitter, isolated man. The elder was a distrustful leader struggling to protect his community. Today we are grandfathers playing together with grandchildren who speak 2 languages and 3 cultures. What do you think changed you?" Silas Miller pondered the question. "I think we discovered our fears were based on ignorance. When you truly get to know the other person, it becomes impossible to see them as an enemy." That evening, during the weekly community dinner, a tradition that had been established to keep everyone connected, Silas Miller watched the generations interacting. Children played together without noticing ethnic differences. Young adults planned projects blending modern technology with ancestral wisdom, and elders from different backgrounds shared stories and experiences. During dinner, special news arrived. The Global Peace Organization had chosen the project as a global model for sustainable development and conflict resolution. An international delegation would soon come for an official visit. The news sparked celebration, but also reflection on responsibilities. Being recognized worldwide brought prestige, but also pressure to maintain the standards they had achieved. "We cannot let recognition change who we are," said Silas Miller during the announcement. "We are a family that decided to live differently. The rest is a consequence." Elder Grey Wolf agreed. "My grandfather says true honor doesn't come from external awards, but from knowing we did what was right." The Global Peace Organization visit brought representatives from 30 countries interested in replicating the model. For 3 days, delegates observed the community's daily operations, participated in planning meetings, and spoke with members of all ages. The head of the delegation, Ambassador Brooks from Mexico, was particularly impressed by the naturalness of the cross-cultural interactions. "In my country, we spend millions on cultural integration programs with limited results. Here I see children who naturally navigate between different traditions." Silas Miller explained, "Ambassador Brooks, our secret is not a program or methodology. It's genuine coexistence. When people share real experiences, caring for each other when sick, celebrating achievements together, solving problems together, superficial differences disappear. The delegate from the Global Peace Organization for Women was impressed by Morningstar's role in the community. How did an elderly Indigenous woman manage to become a maternal figure for people from such diverse backgrounds? Morningstar answered through Chaitan, "My grandmother says motherhood has no ethnic origin. Every woman who lovingly cares for those in need is a universal mother." The simplicity and depth of the answer moved the sheriff, who commented, "This lady has more wisdom about cultural integration than many academic experts." On the last day of the visit, the delegates participated in a special ceremony where Elder Grey Wolf and Silas Miller retold the original story of the project. The simple narrative, a rancher who cared for an injured chief, deeply touched visitors accustomed to complex and costly solutions for social conflicts. Ambassador Brooks remarked, "Gentlemen, you have reminded us that the most effective solutions to human problems are often the simplest. Kindness, respect, and a willingness to listen cost far less than government programs and yield far superior results." Before departing, the Global Peace Organization delegation formalized recognition of the project as an international reference center for sustainable community development. The title would bring resources for expansion and international exchanges, but the recognition that most moved Silas Miller came from an unexpected source. Caleb, now 30 and married to a young woman from the community, announced that his first daughter would be named Sarah Morningstar Thompson, honoring both Silas Miller's first wife and the Indigenous matriarch of the community. "Mr. Silas Miller," said Caleb, "the Sarah you lost was part of what made you capable of caring for Elder Grey Wolf. I want my daughter to bear the name of someone who, even without being present, contributed to all of this." The tribute touched Silas Miller deeply. It was as if his journey was coming full circle. The pain of losing Sarah had transformed into inspiration to care for others, and now it was being honored in a new life that represented the union of all the community's cultures. At the baptism ceremony for little Sarah Morningstar, conducted with elements from the three traditions present in the community, Catholic, Indigenous, and humanist agnostic, Silas Miller reflected on the complete circle his life had traveled. He had begun as a man destroyed by loss, isolated and bitter. Today he was a community grandfather to dozens of children, a mentor to young leaders, and an international symbol of hope. The transformation had begun with a simple choice: to care for someone who needed help. During his speech at the ceremony, Silas Miller said, "When Sarah left, I thought my life was over. When I found Elder Grey Wolf injured, I didn't imagine I was beginning a new existence. Today I understand we don't lose important people. They transform into inspiration for us to love those still with us better." Elder Grey Wolf, now 98, remained surprisingly active and present. His longevity was attributed by Morningstar to the peace of mind he found upon seeing his community not only survive, but thrive through cooperation with other peoples. In a private conversation with Silas Miller after the ceremony, the chief expressed through Chaitan his satisfaction with the fruits of his decision to trust a stranger. "My grandfather says that when he chose to trust you 15 years ago, he was betting on the best of human nature. Today he sees the bet was a sure one," Silas Miller responded emotionally. "Elder Grey Wolf, you taught me that trusting the best in people makes them become the best version of themselves. That was the most valuable lesson of my life." As the years continued to pass, the project solidified as a permanent global reference. Students, researchers, politicians, and activists from around the world made pilgrimages to learn about the model of coexistence that had emerged from the unlikely encounter between a lonely rancher and an injured chief. Silas Miller, now retired from active leadership but still respected as a founder, began dedicating more time to writing the project's memoirs. He wanted to ensure future generations understood not only what was built, but how and why. In his memoirs he wrote, "I learned that social transformation does not happen through grand gestures or political decisions, but through thousands of small daily choices to treat others with dignity and respect. Every time we choose to care instead of ignore, include instead of exclude, listen instead of judge, We plant seeds of change that can grow beyond our imagination. The project had become self-sufficient and was training leaders to replicate the model in other regions. It was no longer a local experiment, but a global grassroots community movement. Chetan, now 45 and internationally recognized as an expert in peaceful conflict resolution, often traveled for consultations, but always returned to the community that remained his home. During one of his presentations at Ivy League College, Chetan was asked what he considered the most important element of the project's success. The most important element, he replied, was the willingness of two people to abandon historical prejudices and see each other as equal human beings. My grandfather and Silas Miller chose to trust each other when it would have been easier to maintain suspicion. That initial choice determined everything that came after. A professor questioned, "But isn't that overly simplistic? Ethnic conflicts have complex historical roots." Chetan smiled. "Professor, historical complexity is real, but it doesn't have to determine the future. In our community, Indigenous and non-Indigenous children grow up together without carrying the resentments of their great-grandfathers. They create a new history based on positive shared experiences." Chetan's answer reflected one of the project's most important discoveries. Although the past must be respected and understood, it should not imprison the future. It was possible to honor ancestral traditions while building new ways of coexistence. Back in the community, Chetan shared with Silas Miller the questions he had faced at Ivy League College. "Silas, sometimes I feel people want to complicate something that is fundamentally simple. They look for scientific formulas to reproduce what we did." Silas Miller laughed. "Chetan, I've learned that educated people sometimes have difficulty accepting simple solutions. They've been trained to believe that complex problems require complex answers. But life has taught me that the deepest truths are often the most obvious ones." "How so?" "Treat others as we would like to be treated. Care for those who need help. Keep your word. Listen before judging. These are principles any child understands, but that adults sometimes forget for considering them too simple." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a special delegation. Representatives from 3 African communities that had successfully implemented models based on the Brazilian project. They came for an exchange of experiences and to bring an unusual proposal. The delegation leader, Malik Adeyemi from Ghana, explained, "Mr. Silas Miller, our projects inspired by your work are thriving. We want to propose an international network of sister communities, connected by the same values, but adapted to local realities." The proposal was ambitious: to create a worldwide federation of sustainable communities that would share resources, knowledge, and mutual support. It would be a form of globalization based on human values instead of economic interests. Silas Miller was intrigued by the possibility. "Malik, how would this network work in practice?" "Youth exchanges between communities, sharing sustainable technologies, mutual support during hardships, and most importantly, strengthening the common values that unite us." Elder Grey Wolf, consulted about the proposal, showed enthusiasm. "My grandfather says this was always his vision, that our community's experience would inspire others around the world. A network of sister communities would be the fulfillment of his most ambitious dreams." The decision to join the network was made in a community assembly with participation from all families. The consensus was unanimous. The project had been born from the generosity of a man who cared for a stranger, and now it could give back by helping other communities around the world. In the following months, young people from the Brazilian community traveled to Africa and Asia to share knowledge, while young people from other continents came to learn about the model of intercultural coexistence developed in the high desert. Silas, though moved by the international expansion, kept his feet on the ground. "It's wonderful to see our experience inspiring people all over the world, but our main focus must continue to be taking good care of our own community. We can only teach what we truly live." Silas's wisdom proved correct when some communities in the network faced difficulties for trying to grow too fast without establishing solid foundations. The Brazilian project served as a model of organic and sustainable growth. In a teleconference with leaders of the global network, Silas shared, "Friends, I have learned that building community is like cultivating plants. You cannot force growth. You can only create favorable conditions and have patience for the roots to develop deeply. The agricultural metaphor resonated with leaders of rural communities on every continent. The network adopted the principle of rooted growth, gradual expansion based on solid values instead of excessive ambitions. As Silas approached 70 years old, he began to think more deeply about the legacy he would leave. The physical project was secure, a prosperous and self-sustaining community. But he wanted to ensure the core values would survive the inevitable generational changes. Working with Chaitin, Caleb, and other community leaders, Silas developed what they called the Constitution of Values, a document that codified the community's non-negotiable principles in a way that future generations could interpret them properly. The document included specific stories that illustrated how the values had been applied in real situations, ensuring they were not just abstract words, but practical guides for action. During a meeting to review the document, Morning Star, now 90 years old, made a precious suggestion through Chaitin. My grandmother says, values are not preserved on paper, but in hearts. She suggests that in addition to the written document, we create annual rituals where we retell our story and renew our commitments. The suggestion resulted in the creation of the Day of Unity, an annual celebration where the entire community gathered to remember how it all began and reaffirm their commitments to the founding values. The first Day of Unity celebration was moving. Silas and Elder Grey Wolf, now 100 years old, retold the original story to an audience of more than 600 people, including children born in the community who were hearing the full details for the first time. During his speech, Silas said, "Children, you were born into a special community where people from different backgrounds live as family. This didn't happen by chance. It was the result of conscious choices to prioritize love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, cooperation over competition." A 7-year-old child asked, "Uncle Silas, why did you take care of Elder Grey Wolf if you didn't know him?" The simple question touched Silas Miller deeply. Because he needed help, and I could help. Sometimes the most important decisions in life are the most obvious ones. But weren't you scared? Silas smiled. I was a little scared, yes. But I learned that doing the right thing, even when we're afraid, is what we call courage. The conversation with the children became an annual tradition. Silas discovered that explaining community values to children forced him to distill them to their purest, most understandable essence. As the years passed, Silas watched with satisfaction as the second generation of leaders was taking on responsibilities. Chaitin had become a respected international statesman. Caleb was recognized as an expert in sustainable community development, and Silas's own children were developing their own projects within the expanded community. His eldest son, Samuel Miller, had become a veterinarian specializing in traditional indigenous animal care techniques. His daughter, Sarah, named after his first wife, was a teacher and coordinated the educational programs that attracted students from all over the world. Watching his children work naturally alongside Indigenous youth, Silas felt fulfilled. They had grown up truly multicultural, comfortable both in international meetings and in traditional DNA rituals. On a special September afternoon, exactly 20 years after the first meeting, Silas was organizing old photographs when Eleanor brought extraordinary news. She was pregnant again, at 48. The unexpected news moved Silas deeply. After 4 children and many years, he hadn't imagined they would have another baby. "Eleanor, are you sure you want to go through this again at this stage in life?" "Silas, I grew up in this community watching how you and Elder Grey Wolf turned a chance encounter into something that changed the lives of hundreds of people. I want our 5th child to be born here, in this special place, surrounded by all this history of love and cooperation." The birth of Gabriel Miller, 6 months later, was celebrated by the entire community. He was the first baby born during the project's 3rd decade, symbolizing continuity and renewal. Elder Grey Wolf, now 101 years old, insisted on participating in the baby's blessing ceremony. His trembling hands touched the newborn's forehead as he murmured words in Diné that Chaitin translated, My grandfather is blessing Gabriel to grow with the wisdom to preserve the peace he found here." Silas held his newborn son and looked around the room full of people he considered family. 20 years earlier, he was a lonely man on a property he discovered was fraudulent. Now he held a baby, surrounded by a community that had become a global model of harmonious coexistence. "Gabriel," he whispered to his son, "you were born in a very special place. Here you will learn that differences between people are a reason for celebration, not conflict. You will grow up knowing that caring for others is the quickest way to heal our own soul." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope you were moved by this beautiful story of transformation, love, and overcoming. Silas Miller taught us that a simple act of kindness can change not only our own life, but the destiny of hundreds of people. What did you think of his decision to care for Elder Grey Wolf? Would you do the same? Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and share your own experiences of kindness and solidarity. Did you enjoy this touching story? Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one. Your participation is very important to us.